over a period of time, I have arrived at the understanding that to make sense of what's going on requires, or it has required for me, abandoning most of what I'd been told about the world, the universe and everything that surrounds it. And I've been opening up to learning new things, new evidence, new interpretations, new perspectives, and all the time opening myself up to contact with all manner of new people and their ideas. And part of that has been this process with the podcast and reaching out and listening to comments that come back. And I can imagine how what I've just said sounds. All sounds a bit sort of conspiracist and woo-woo, but it's not really. The fact is that at this point in my life, I simply know that I've spent too long trying to perform, well, the contortions that are required to rationalise and internalise so much of what is all around us, the water in which we swim and breathe like fish. So much of which just doesn't fit together naturally. At least not the way the authorities are telling us to fit it together. And there's always this pressure to just jam the jigsaw puzzle pieces together, even though they don't really work. And I see, and I have for a while now, I see and have seen that I'd been forcing it all to make sense in ways that required abandoning evidence, often ignoring the obvious, when in fact it's easier to accept that so much that sounds and looks like lies and bollocks is lies and bollocks. And it's quite a relief in the end, it has been for me to relax and accept that old line about something that looks like a duck and waddles like a duck and quacks like a duck, you probably being a duck. But speaking of birds, I saw last week that we're being warned about another pandemic of bird flu. But the good news is, everyone, that the clever people at Global Inventivax are way ahead and have the necessary jabs all but ready to roll out. What a relief. My money's on more mRNA. That's just me. Also last week, I read about how by September this year, 2024, in the UK, it will be illegal to have so much as a single chicken in your back garden, a roaming and a pecking, unless it's registered with the government. There's a £5,000 fine looming for anyone harbouring a fugitive chicken in their yard. Fancy that. Now, I read about all this and I shake my head. It's involuntary. It just happens. There's so much of this. It's always hard to know what to notice or think about first. You know, it's like looking up at the sky and seeing a million stars and wondering what pictures might be made from the various twinkly dots. And, you know, as they say, though, once you see it, you can't not see it. That's a cliche now, but it's really important and it's really true. All this incessant stuff about pandemics and birds is against a backdrop of the approaching changes to the World Health Organization, the WHO Pandemic Preparedness Treaty, and the International Health Regulations, IHR, that go along with it. And even now, after years of warning, too few people have paid any, far less enough attention to just this singular quacking duck. It's worth knowing that the WHO treaty and the IHR is just a big duck. Unless WHO member states opt out, it's an opt-out scenario, you know, and if the UK is a member state and it's showing no signs whatever of opting out, because that would require our government doing something in service of the people, and that ain't going to happen. So when that WHO treaty is amended and the IHR is updated, the WHO will call the shots. So that in the future, if the WHO says lockdown, for whatever reason, then we will lock down. If the WHO declares a health emergency, and that is loose, that could be a pandemic, or it could be to do with, let's say, the open inverted commas, climate crisis, close inverted commas, which you might argue that there's a health component there. And so in the event of something identified by the WHO as being climate crisis, then there's a health emergency right there as far as they're concerned. And there will be no possibility of questioning and no possibility of any challenge. If they say it's a health emergency, it's a health emergency. We in the UK and in all of the member states that don't opt out are preparing to surrender national sovereignty to an entity funded in the main by Bill Gates. What could possibly go wrong? The man that said, let's invent computer viruses so that we can sell them software to fix it. Under those circumstances, the WHO will issue orders that all member states will have to obey. It's as cut and dried as that. Pandemics used to be rare events. You might have noticed. But now the mood music appears to be that we should expect a pandemic to come along like a bus, one after the other. So when I talk about learning new explanations, or at least being minded to listen to alternatives, I am minded to mention, just as an example, that I pretty much grew up hearing about the so-called Spanish flu pandemic at the end of the First World War. I'm that age. Heard about it at school. My dad talked about it in relation to his parents, who were alive at the time. And I've written it into some of my own books. I've written about how millions died of the Spanish flu, maybe 20 million, maybe more, maybe 5 times that number. It's impossible to settle on a figure. I've read all sorts about what the infection was, where the infection came from. I've even seen the US soldiers blamed, in part, that they came into Europe late in the war, all young and fit and healthy and well fed compared to the Europeans who'd been weakened by 3 years of devastating war, and how those American servicemen may have carried the infection into Europe from home, somehow or other spreading microscopic traces of bird flu from America, embedded in the dirt, in the treads on the soles of their boots. Well, all of that is maybe, but it's only much more recently that I've read about how the misuse of aspirin, which was new then, and certainly less than fully understood in terms of its potential toxicity. We all know you can only take whatever, 8 in a day, or you risk overdosing. We didn't know that then. And so at the time of the Spanish flu pandemic, so-called, aspirin was promoted by the drugs industry as a miracle treatment. And it was heavily endorsed by doctors wanting to be seen to do something in the face of circumstances that made them feel helpless. And doctors don't like feeling helpless. I've read about how quickly some victims succumbed to the Spanish flu, much faster than people would normally go down and die with flu. It happened really quickly. People went rapidly downhill, ending up with bloody froth from their noses, bluing of the lips and the flesh around the mouth and nose. Like oxygen deprivation, basically. Well, it turns out those are the symptoms of aspirin overdose. It turns out doctors saw aspirin as offering hope in the face of a pandemic that seemed to overwhelm them. But they had little sense of how much and how often people should take aspirin. There's anecdotal stuff about people taking handfuls at a time, just crunching down on handfuls of it. And so overdosing and then dying with build-up of fluid in the lungs, blue lips, bloody frothing, the works. So when you know all that and you allow for all that, then suddenly the understanding of what might have happened to so many people so quickly looks different. It just looks different. Less about disease, more about human hubris and misuse of a new product, well-meaning or not. The short story is that unknowable numbers of people may have died not of the flu, but of the medicine they were prescribed in the face of it. Anyhow, let's not get too wrapped up in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1920. Go and have a read. There's plenty of stuff out there, including quite recent medical re-examinations of what went on. My point is only that something like a so-called pandemic is so huge and so apparently overwhelming that in among it might be hard to see the wood on account of all the trees. So I look on everything around us and at the official explanations and statements that go along with it, and I just wonder. I wonder first and foremost about the most recent stuff, stuff that surrounds us right now. War in Ukraine, blamed on what we were told was unprovoked Russian aggression. Oh, do you think so? I think about climate crisis, blamed on our gas boilers and burping cows. I wonder about war in the Middle East. I look on now at an event like the so-called ISIS-K atrocity in that theatre in Moscow, and I just wonder. I look at everything, and I see much of it as though for the first time. I look at the food we're told to eat. When I say it's all-encompassing, it's everything. I look at the food we're told to eat. Foods we're told are good for us. Foods that are the path leading to healthy lives, we're told. But then, more recently, I read about it. I read about seed oils, so-called vegetable oils. Put the word vegetable in front of anything and you can sell it to the gullible public as a health option. Vegetable oils. Sounds healthy. That's just as a for instance. Gazillions of gallons of seed oils are consumed every year. Now I'm talking about canola oil, sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, any of these things, any of them. And people have it on their salads, people fry with it, deep fry with it, shallow fry with it, you name it. You buy chips when you're out at a restaurant, they've probably been fried in vegetable oil. And it turns out those are rancid products, so foul in their raw state that you wouldn't dream, you wouldn't willingly sniff the smell of them, far less put them in your mouth. And for the longest time, those products were used only as machine lubricants, oil in the wheels on tractors, until someone found out that they could be ultra processed, until their rancid nature was made undetectable to humans. You could clarify them, make them look golden and nice, and then you could sell them to people to eat and cook with. So seed oils, to name but one everyday food product, pushed on us as healthy options. They're not what you think. For ages now, my family, goodness knows, we've consumed our share of vegetable oils over the years, but not anymore. My family and I, we avoid them like the plague. We use butter, tallow, lard, and olive oil instead. And do you remember when they told us that butter was bad for us? And eggs were bad for us? Only have one egg a week. It's a long list of misinformation. Cereals were fed only to livestock until the US had a glut of cereals in the early 20th century, year on year. Mountains of the stuff. What we're going to do with it? And clever old Mr. Kellogg and others realised that they could be repackaged, repurposed and sold to the people as cheap, healthy breakfast options. Hello, cornflakes, and the rest. And we've been bombarded for years about how meat is bad news for our health, for the health of the planet. Industry, the food industry pushes so-called plant-based alternatives. Have you looked at the ingredients on the packaging for those products? Just as a random. It's like the stuff of chemical experiments. More like that than anything a sane person would want to put into their body. You won't recognise the majority of the names on the list. And it goes up. Bill Gates, dear old Bill, and Jeff Bezos of Amazon, they're among the billionaires developing and pushing fake meat grown in the lab. Frankenstein stuff. But if you read about that product, you learn that pound for pound, lab grown meat causes much more environmental damage than any herd of livestock. And so it goes on. A few weeks ago on my GB News show, I talked to, he's a retired nurse, a lifelong nurse practitioner, and he's still a health educator. He trained and continues to train nurses and other health professionals. He's a friend of mine now, as it happens, Dr. John Campbell. And I talked to him on the show about the sudden incidence of fibrous white blood clots that are being pulled from corpses by pathologists and morticians and the rest of the professions who investigate what happened to the dead, or they prepare the dead for burial or funerals and so on. And I've read reports that those disgusting things, those white clots, are new to most of those pathologists, morticians, certainly on the scale at which they're seeing them now. They're turning up now in around one in every fifth body. Right, 20% of corpses have these fibrous clots in them. They fill a leg. They look like a mould that's been taken from inside an artery or inside a vein with something sort of white and rubbery. That's what they look like. And they're a new reality compared to the world before 2020. Pathologists didn't see them. Now, I had Dr. John on the show just to describe the phenomenon. And by then he had talked to experts in the US who had started, sharing information with one another, coming up with numbers. And John and I wondered together whether just perhaps more people should be more aware of something being found in every fifth dead body. I mean, you'd think a happening like this, what appears to be a sudden phenomenon, would attract mainstream media attention and would have the science going into overdrive to try and find out what's happening. You'd think that. You'd think it was newsworthy. But no, the official silence on the matter of the white clots is about as deafening as the silence around the alarming and sustained increase in excess deaths since 2021, or at least the increased incidence of excess deaths that was there until the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, changed the way it counts the numbers. So that now, surprise, surprise, it appears that fewer people died all along. Aye, right. I read this stuff. I watch these developments in one field of expertise after another, and inevitably I find I wonder about everything else that has come at us through official channels for all the years of my life. And I can't necessarily speak of it for anyone else, but for me it's a brave new world out there. It's a brave new world made of listening to those who might otherwise be silenced and censored into invisibility. I've only mentioned a handful of disconnected examples, but the cracks in the official account are across the whole picture. The picture I had looked at with trusting eyes for all of my life before, not anymore. And the good news, always on the hunt for good news, the good news is that I do know that I am not alone. That in fact millions of people around the world see the same cracks in the same official picture. The official account of the world around us, especially the portrayal of good guys versus bad guys, is fraying and falling apart. And we're talking to each other. We're sharing information. We're sharing ideas. Happens on here. Happens all over. The powers that be, I'm loath to call them that, but I use that language so you know who I'm talking about. The powers that be, I'm sure of it, have never been so weakened, so exposed. Like bed bugs. Somebody pulls back the sheets and turns on a light. If fewer people trust the powers that be than ever before, and that trust is gone forever, good riddance. All they seek to do, the powers that be, in the face of it, is more and more of what they always do, what they've always done, which is keep peddling the same old stuff, just more and more of it, and faster and faster. The truth is, I used to see a picture that seemed to make sense to me, but not anymore. Now, Mostly, I hear quacking and I see a lot of ducks.